Hello, this is Darren DePaul, the voice of Emperor Valkorion, and you're watching another video by Vulkk.
Let's move on to the class changes. You did post quite a lot on the forums yesterday. Would you mind walking us through the class changes? Why does the Sentinel Marauder get special attention? Why did you delete the Skank Tank possibility and things like that?
So I'll talk about, Marauders. Marauders is pretty easy. We talked a little bit about it in the post, but I believe it was Fury specifically was overperforming just a little bit. And so we made one of the passives of one of their abilities take like a 20%-ish, nerf a little less than that, just to kind of bring their damage down just a little bit. And then Obfuscate was strong because what it created was a situation where if someone got obfuscated, they literally couldn't get CC'd. Marauders just were unable to be CC'd, which was not fun because it meant there was an ability with no counterplay, which isn't really a fun experience for someone on the receiving end. So we changed it instead to be 75% damage reduction as opposed to 75% mischance. So it takes RNG out of playing against Obfuscate, and it still allows the Marauder to have survivability, but there is counterplay for the other class. So those are kind of the changes that happened for Marauder and Sentinel. So the class change. So let's talk about Skank Tanks for a second. So the changes were really simple, but there was two things, and I want to make sure to highlight the two things. So I know everyone's really focusing on the fact that we did these changes to bring Skank Tanks in line, which is true, but don't forget the second part of it, which is even just without Skank Tanks being in the equation, tanks were doing more damage than the team intended. So the nerf to damage for tanks, yes, it will impact Skank Tanks, but that is not the only reason we made the change. They were doing too much damage. So we brought damage down across the board for tanks in the game. Now, players did bring up very, very good points, which is something the team talked about a lot internally as well, is that part of the problem with tanks in PvP is the way defense works and how it relates to internal and elemental damage. All of that is completely true, and it's definitely something the team is aware of and looking into. But part of that is if we change how stats impact damage reduction in PvP, you're talking about very large systemic changes to itemization and how it impacts damage reduction. That's kind of like expansion level stuff where you're talking about things of
really big stat adjustments.
What stats do, what they affect. That's really big stuff that would need to happen. So the team is definitely aware of it, and there may be some more elegant, more future changes that we can do to address things like that.
And keep suggestions coming, of course.
And please keep suggestions coming because there's a lot of really good suggestions. But at least for the interim, because tanks were doing too much damage, that got reduced, which should also help some of the skank tanking problems. We do understand that that may not correct all of the problems people feel like tanks have in PvP, not lost on us at all. But this is kind of a first step because of that. So that's kind of the changes we made.
And then obviously raising the threat generation.
Right, and raising correct. We're raising threat generation to make sure that was also not a problem. And then the other thing we made is pretty much across the board utility buffs for damage reduction for certain classes. Again, we know that still highlights some other problems of concerns about like lightning and sages and sorks not doing enough damage, especially compared to mercs. None of that is lost on us either. But again, this was kind of a first step to increase some of the damage reduction related to some of those classes, something we'll continue to monitor for future changes.
So this is actually not a continuation with fixes as a relation to what you did several patches ago. This is a new, how should I put it? This is a new beginning of changes to the classes, new balancing.
Yes,
perhaps.
Yes and no. I mean, I guess that's kind of a way to look at it.
Obviously, it was based on data gathered since the last set of changes. So in a way, it's based off of those changes.
Right.
But
it's the same boulder sort of that's rolling, like especially the changes to tanks specifically, where there was rebalancing across the board for DPS classes to understanding where they fell in relation to each other. And then as kind of the fallout from that, we looked at what tanks were doing, and tanks were doing a little too much. So
how do you expect these changes specifically to the tank's damage will reflect on PvE?
That's a very good question, and it's something that definitely was a concern with the team. One of the things that actually the team had talked about, the changes when we were looking at them originally could have potentially been even more than what we did, but we wanted to be very sensitive to the fact that someone who's a solo player that plays a tank in tank gear, they're going to do quite a bit less damage than they did before, and that's a negative impact to their play experience. So we need to be cautious of that understanding of balancing PvP, operations play and solo play against each other means that this is going to have a negative impact against other people as well. And that's why I wanted to really highlight the fact that this change was not just made for Skank Tanks. This was made because tanks across the board were doing more damage than the team intended. So it's something we're going to continue to monitor. But the thing to keep in mind is, and we highlighted this a lot last year when we talked about damage calculations across the board for DPS classes, is that our game across the board, like the new ops encounters from Gods from the Machine, etc., they are all balanced against the balance targets that the combat team has. So when we say that tanks were doing too much damage, that means that even when their damage gets reduced following 5-9, that should still fall in line with what Gods from the Machine was balanced against. So it may seem like it's negatively impactful, and I understand that people are used to the damage that it exists right now, but the game is actually balanced against the balanced targets, not what's in the game currently. So when we're moving things around the balanced targets, there shouldn't be a large negative impact to the way things are in game. Everything should still be beatable and should still be playable, but that's the stuff we're going to monitor in data to make sure that that's actually true. Because if it's not, there's a problem and we need to correct it the other way.
Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the video.